Alrighty, today we're going to be talking about objective personality, using an understanding personality analysis to develop more intelligent empathy. We're going to be talking about Paul Ekman, looking at what objective personality is, his type, and developing an empathy strategy. For people who are familiar with Myers-Briggs, these axes are going to remind you of those letters that you see often, the S versus the N, the T and the F. Those are the two axes. The S versus N is the axis along which people process information. S has to do with sensing things in physical reality, and has to do with intuition, abstraction, and interpolation. On the decision axis, that as on one end you have feeling, which has to do with values, likes, and dislikes, versus thinking, which is reasons why you do something. So the name of the game is to guess the same type that Dave and Shannon do, and I did pretty well. Missed a couple things though, and we'll get into that. So Paul Ekman, in 1967, he studied the expressions of patients who claimed that they were not depressed. Later they committed suicide. He was the guy who came up with microexpressions, right? So these patients frequently had flashes of expressions that revealed strong negative emotions, dark feelings that they were not expressing, and he used that as a foundation for the study of microexpressions. Later on, he discovered that facial expressions of emotions are culturally independent. So people in rural tribes that had not been exposed to a lot of globalization interpreted facial expressions to mean the same as people in lots of other different cultures and parts of the world. That was really cool stuff. He later on wrote a best-selling book about facial expressions, detecting lying and deception, inspired a TV show, which was really neat. This system is not effective. It's not accurate. People who are trained in the system do not do a better job of detecting lies than people who are not trained in the system. But he did create the system for looking at individual muscle groups inside faces, and that became foundational research for a lot of future work on understanding emotions. So we're going to start with deciders. We have feeling versus thinking, and we're going to be looking at which of these things Paul is engaged in the most. So here he is with an interviewer asking him a very F-y question. How do you feel about famous people that you worked with?
And you went there at a time when there were a lot of famous scholars and a lot of famous students. So what was that like for you, leaving East Orange, New Jersey, and
South Orange?
South
Big
Orange,
difference,
yeah.
big difference.
Yeah, so he says, get your facts straight. So he's asked an F-y question, and he responds with, we need to get this information correct. Here's a question. What did college do for you?
Well, it saved my life. It furnished my mind. It told me to aim as high as you possibly can.
So those are definitely thinking statements. Here's a continuation of that.
It was up to you. You had to learn how to think critically. Boy, I loved it.
So yeah, that's more thinking statements. This is a question asking him what he remembers of people that he worked with. And he comes up with a laundry list, and he talks about their accomplishments from an external perspective, but nothing about them, what type of people were, what they valued.
yeah. And who else was there at that time?
Well, Susan Sontag sat next to me in most of my classes. Mike Nichols, Elaine May. Quite a number of people who went on, more in theater than anything else, surprisingly enough. I'm trying to think. I know there were some good writers. Poet David Ray did quite well, and there were a lot of nutty people too.
Yeah, yeah.
So you'll notice that he talks about people in terms of sort of their career accomplishments and paths, but again, almost no emotional talk here. The interviewer keeps asking F-y questions, and he keeps not getting any F-y. This is probably an indication that the interviewer has F-y as one of their primary functions, would be a guess. And the fact that they're not communicating on the same level is a pretty good example of crosstalk. So here's another question. The interviewer asks how other people would have what Paul thinks other people would think about Paul.
Yeah. And if Susan Sontag, in her sort of wonderful, hyper-literate way, were going to describe you as a 15-year-old University of Chicago undergraduate.
Very shy. Not as shy as she was. They were the two of us, the shyest people in the class, sitting next to each other. I never had a class with more than 15 people, and there was a lot of pressure for you to participate in discussion. And it was a real strain for both of us.
So it's interesting because the interviewer keeps asking these very FE-oriented questions. What do you think about other people? What do other people think about you? And Paul has a hard time answering those questions directly. This one is interesting. He responds, I am an introvert, which is interesting because Paul is very, very talkative, and that's not something that introverts normally are. And the interviewer comments on that.
You know, I don't think of you as being shy.
Well, that's because you only see the exterior. Inside is a very shy person.
Yeah.
So that distinction between your outside expression versus your internal expression is one of those things that I think objective personality handles really well, and we'll be talking more about this later, so put a pin in this. Paul really likes to kind of go on about details and things, and it's not necessarily details that you're interested in, but just like kind of laying out all kinds of information all the time.
But what I learned the most from was I got a job working on the New York waterfront. And I was the night clerk in a hotel with a whorehouse on one side and a loan shark on the other, and the headquarters of the mafia across the street. And so
It
for
sounds
2
like,
years,
yeah.
that was the education.
It's kind of like the three cornerstones of your existence.
Yes.
The mafia, the loan shark, and where did you find yourself drifting?
You left one of them out.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is a cool piece of evidence because we might hypothesize that the interviewer is some sort of savior FE or has FE in the top of the stack. FE is going to be very sensitive to how do people respond to things. So talking about whorehouses in public is not really kosher. That's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. So he skips over it, and Paul's like, yeah, you didn't talk about the whorehouse enough. I mentioned the whorehouse. That's interesting. So this is kind of a piece of evidence that Paul does not really care about saying weird stuff that makes people uncomfortable. So there's a piece of evidence. Okay, so we've seen a lot of T-talk and almost zero F feelings value I like talk or people like talk. Very little coming from Paul. So probably T, and we're going to, now we have to figure out if we think this is TI or TE. So TI is introverted thinking, where the decisions come from myself, versus TE, which is about decisions that work for other people. How do these decisions work in the spectrum of decisions that other people are making? So I actually got this wrong. I thought that he was TI because he seems like such an introvert. He didn't talk a lot about other people's accomplishments, and he didn't talk about how much he was influenced by other people. So I thought that he was TI, but he's actually TE, and we'll go into that a little bit. So the big hint there is that Paul will not stop talking. Holy bejesus. He is very, very blasty, and blast is an introverted observer combined with an extroverted decider. So you're looking at one of these four pairs of functions being close to his top, right? So the decider is either going to be TE or FE, and we kind of have to figure out which one it is. So if Paul is talking to people and giving them advice, is this value-based advice or is this logistical logic-based advice? And so here's an example of Paul talking to people, telling them how to practice mindfulness.
The first step is to keep a diary of when you become emotional. Now, you won't know in advance, but you'll surely know when it's over that you just had an emotional episode. Write it down in detail. Do this for a month. Then go through it and look for what are the themes that are causing your emotions. If it isn't apparent to you, get a friend to look at it. But it should be very apparent to you when you read through this diary. And you should be able to identify 3 or 4 redundant things that are again and again getting you to act emotionally. Now, the ones where you think you responded emotionally and there was no reason to be emotional, draw a red circle around them.
So this is very practical, logistical advice around keeping a diary, write these things down, make a list, get a friend to help you circle things and identify them. This is T talk giving you advice on how to do your feelings. So this is probably TE giving other people like very practical advice. So yeah, looking at TE here. He also, one of the interesting things is that whenever he talks about his university experience that we looked at before, at first I thought it was introverted, but one of the things you'll notice is the university taught him all of these things. His decisions and the way that he proceeded through life when he talks about his life journey was shaped by these external forces, not by internal forces.
It was up to you. You had to learn how to think critically. Boy, I loved it.
Yeah, so this is a little hint of FI, but it really is focusing on external forces.
Well, it saved my life. It furnished my mind. It told me to aim as high as you possibly can.
So those are actually TE statements from an introverted person, which is interesting. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about observers, sensing versus intuition. So someone who is on the sensing end of the spectrum is going to be very precise, try to talk about things which are tangible and clear and observable, versus someone who is doing end speak is going to be doing pattern talk, where like this is the pattern, this is where things are going to go, and they're okay making approximations. So here's a question. What is your theory and understanding of the mind?
I say they're mental, I mean that they don't involve physical pain. Of course, everything is mental. I mean, everything is really being directed, at least in my mind, not in the Dalai Lama's mind, but it's all coming from the brain. That's where everything originates. And the Dalai Lama and I disagree in that he believes when the brain is dead, the mind still is alive and continues. And I don't. I think the mind is just a less precise term for the mental activities that are generated by the brain.
So one of the things that he does over and over again is whenever he introduces something that could be an abstract concept, he's always breaking that definition down into its components and trying to anchor them to something in physical reality. So here's another example where he's talking about the definition of compassion. And he has a hard time staying on that topic. He drifts and then he tries to explain other sort of related things.
Definition of compassion and empathy as you do?
I know he has the same definition of compassion. We have not yet. I hope in our next meeting we will see whether we agree about empathy. Now, I'm using another term that some other investigators use.
Yeah, so he needs to explain the definitions of all of the components of the things that he is using. So before he introduces something like, oh, what's the relationship between compassion and empathy? You have to talk about the definition of compassion, all the components of that definition, before you can build up to that concept. So he kind of sidetracks and talks about this definition of a different type of emotional connection.
Empathy. Now, I'm using another term that some other investigators use, which is resonance. And resonance simply refers to the actual experience of having the same experience. Whether or not I can resonate to you in two very different ways. If I can resonate by having the same feeling, or I can resonate with quite a different feeling. So if you're angry, I can say, oh, I'm so sorry that you're angry. I feel really badly that you're so angry, that you've been so frustrated. That's a resonant response, but it's not the same feeling.
So making very clear incremental distinctions between things and looking at the smallest components of the definition that he can possibly use. So the interviewer is really trying to get him to think more about the broader picture and ends up just straight up asking him, can you come up with a metaphor to describe these things so that we can relate to all of these concepts a little bit more easily?
Definition of empathy and compassion. And another way of looking at the definition is the use of metaphors. Empathy is kind of defined commonly as the metaphor of looking through someone else's eyes and standing in someone else's shoes. And I was wondering if you had like a personal metaphor of what empathy would be like.
Well, if I look through your eyes, then the question is, is it me who is still looking, or has my self merged with yourself? I don't think of that as being a necessary part of empathy. It's only the resonance for the affective or the cognitive appraisal that I can do something, that I can understand the feelings that you're having.
So in this case, he's continually taking a idea and breaking it down into its individual components. So this actually kind of connects with the work that he does when he is trying to do all this emotional understanding. And what he does is he takes something like these muscle groups and then breaks them down, looking at the individual components of emotional expression.
So the 7 universal emotions are fear, anger, sadness, disgust, contempt, surprise, and enjoyment. And I spent the next 8 years developing a technique for quantifying and measuring all the movements the face can make, which I call the facial action coding system. And that was published in '78. It took me 8 years, a long time. But it opened everything. For science, for teaching, it's used by all the animation studios when they want to animate expression. I would never have really discovered microexpressions if I didn't have this tool that allowed me to look so precisely at everything the face did.
So what he did in order to tackle this big task was to find a way of taking this complicated system and breaking it down to as precise and distinct, concrete individual components as possible. So this is a guy who is much more comfortable thinking in terms of physical, clearly understandable reality. And so now we have to separate it between SI and SE. So SI has to do with introverted sensing, which is organizing physical reality, moving in incremental fashion. This is someone who is more comfortable with order over chaos versus someone who is SE, which is really someone who wants to absorb a lot of new data, new experiences, and is more comfortable with chaos over order. And I think it's pretty clear from the previous clips which one he is, but we're just going to give a couple more examples of this, where when he is given a task or a challenge, he breaks it down into its individual steps.
You got to practice it all the time. It's like being a concert pianist. It doesn't stick unless you practice it. So let's take problem number 1. Having more choice about what you become emotional about. And that's the only reason we want that is because sometimes we become emotional about things that we don't think merit becoming emotional. Or we act in a way that we don't approve of afterwards. That's the number 2 problem.
So this is an example of him taking a problem and breaking it down step by step as a way of managing a bigger task and kind of managing that chaos. So this is SI work. So the original theory that I had was that this is clearly someone who is thinking in incremental, concrete steps, so SI, and he's really focused on thinking. So my original theory was someone who is sleep, blast, consume, play. So someone who is very much an introvert, thinking and ruminating on concrete reality and the decisions that need to be made, probably monologues a lot, very blasty, introspective, probably kind of socially awkward, and does a really bad job of pinging off of the tribe. So Dave and Shannon typed him, and they picked out that his thinking his thinking statements were very focused on his environment, the way that other things shaped his thinking, which is kind of a cool distinction to make. This is someone who is very, very blasty. So as a first function, so just taking his understood information and shooting it into people's faces all the time. But this is also someone who is demon FI, right? So his own feelings are very difficult for him to access and process. So he's going to have a hard time believing that he's allowed to feel, being able to manage his emotions. Like, does he actually have to do this? It's interesting the way empathizing with someone on this front, because this is a person who is going to be giving a lot of very practical, concrete, logistical advice to people, whether or not they want it. And he is having a hard time processing his own emotions. Now, David and Shannon have typed him as masculine TE, masculine SI, feminine NE, feminine NI. So the feminine functions tend to be a little more flexible. They don't resolve as quickly, and they are a little bit harder for the person using them to detect them. So if you have a demon feminine function, this is going to be a part of your cognitive blindness area where you're really going to have a hard time seeing your own feelings. And being masculine TE and masculine SI is going to be very punchy, where he's just kind of like acting on the world rather than adjusting to it. And Dave and Shannon had a really interesting take on what the implications for his childhood might be having these functions.
I was a very non-aggressive kid. My older sister used to beat me up all the time. I have scars in my eyebrows and in my head from when she hit me with telephones and things like that. And my parents used to say, Paul, fight back. You're as big as she is now. But I wasn't a fighter. So what turned me for a long period of time into a fighter, into someone who struggled with anger management? I believe that it was the hatred that developed. Now, hatred is a second cousin of anger. It's not anger. It's a transformation. It's an enduring state. It's a preoccupation. The Buddhists would say it's a poison. And I like that idea because I've come to believe that if you maintain hatred, it is corrosive and will turn you into a hostile personality if you weren't one before.
All really good, true stuff. So one thing that he says, we see this all goddamn day long, and you really got to catch this one, is that people are born a certain type. So it's like me saying, well, I'm just weird with computers because one time in junior high, this happened, and my brother did this, and my dad, and then forever then I've been changed. Like, hey, great. Can I get some VHS tapes of that? Can I go back and interview your family? Can I look at other people of your same type that are currently 9 years old and see what's going on?
That's the biggest one.
Like, people think, I was totally normal, and then right around 12, I got all fucked up, and now I'm this way. It's like, no, that's your self-story.
Self-story,
If we could talk to your sister, if we could see what was going on, what we're seeing consistently in the data is all people with masculine TE at the top. Though you might go through a quiet, dormant stage,
right,
that anger is always there.
Always.
It's always there. It's always been there. And something by the age of 12 triggers it off, and you're like, that caused it. No. That was always there.
Right. The biggest thing that has helped me over the years kind of recognize that, and again, I'm a censor, so I have to do it the hard way, but like the amount of other ladies of my same type had the exact same story over and over and over and over and over again. Everybody with lead masculine TE, same story. They're picking on me. They're mean to me. That is why I turned into an angry person. That is why I got aggressive.
A bunch of coincidences.
Every double masculine I've ever heard of always talks about how every time they go into a room,
people fight with me.
Everybody fights with them.
So this is kind of an interesting thing, and this is getting into kind of the deeper empathy that objective personality opens up, I think. So this is someone who is Savior TE, DMNFI. They have a really hard time noticing their own feelings, noticing their own emotions. Doing any sort of emotional regulation is going to be really hard for them. And growing up, they might be more angry, more violent, more reactive than they remember, than they think they are. And so this is one of those places where Paul's recollection of what happened at growing up might be very, very different from the way that other people remember Paul growing up. But Paul has decided to do something about this. So taking time to appreciate Paul, right? This is a guy who has a lot of difficulty processing his own feelings. That's really going to hit you as a kid. He gets angry when people shove on him too much, and he wants to control those feelings. So he dedicates his life to the study of emotions, emotional manifestation, and learning how to regulate those feelings. And once he feels like he's learned how to do this super difficult thing that was really hard for him, he sets about teaching other people how to do the same sort of thing, which is a really cool growth journey. So this is someone who has a hard time with emotional management, who dedicates his life to understanding the concrete physical steps of doing emotional management if you have a really hard time with that. And so remember, Paul is very blasty. He has a hard time listening to other people. But when you see him later in life talking to the Dalai Lama, he's actually doing a lot of listening. Now, he's not very happy doing that listening, and you can kind of watch this clip and see, like the expression on his face, but he is actually listening to people.
Basic sort of aim is how to cultivate calm mind. With calm mind, intelligence also can utilize properly. Disturbed mind, you cannot utilize because of the intelligence properly. We cannot see objectively. Real destroyer of calm mind is anger, hatred, fear, suspicion, distrust, these things. So therefore, the opposite counterforce of these things is warm-heartedness. Respect other, love other, recognize their right things, they are right, and then no room anger.
So this is a very Effie kind of talks if you just love people and have warm feelings, then the negative emotions will just kind of go away, which probably isn't very helpful and isn't going to resonate necessarily a lot with Paul, but he's taking it like a champion. So empathy tips. So how can we relate to Paul or understand Paul? Well, if you're engaging with someone who is like Paul, you're going to need a lot of patience. He's going to talk a lot slowly about physical things that you probably understand in great detail. And so you're just going to have to be willing to take in a lot more him talking at you than him listening to you or engaging with you. You're going to have to stay in the concrete realm because he's going to have a really hard time. Anytime you have an abstract word or term or idea, he's going to want to break down into its individual components. And being FI, he talks about his own anger issues, but he's probably going to be sensitive to being called immoral or being called a bad person or being out of control or something like that. That's really going to bother him. So what are some things that are hard for Paul? Well, listening, dealing with any sort of feelings is going to be hard. People are going to use these abstract terms all the time without defining their terms first, and he's going to get lost really, really quickly. And he's going to have a lot of difficulty with cognitive blindness around his emotions and the emotions of others. He's just not going to see it. And so I think this is kind of one of my favorite examples of cognitive blindness. So cognitive blindness is when you have a function or a set of functions that you're not observing well or accurately. And that is made worse when you have feminine demon functions because they're fuzzy, they're less well defined, you're not spending any time thinking about them. That's really hard for you. And so it's kind of interesting because when he talks about developing these tricks for emotional regulation is hard for him. And the classic mistake that people frequently make is assuming that other people work the same way they do. So listen to him talking about how hard it is for everyone to do emotional regulation.
You want to be able to choose what you become emotional about and when you become emotional. That's number one. And the second is you want to be able to choose how you act when you are emotional. Well, nature didn't want you to do either. So it didn't give you any tools. So if you're going to learn how to do this, it's going to be hard work, and it isn't going to be the kind of learning like learning to ride a bicycle.
So he's going to be going out into the world assuming that everyone needs the same type of practical advice on how to regulate their emotions that he needed and he had to develop himself. And kind of an extension of that cognitive blindness again, when he is engaging with people, he's not going to notice things that he did to them, ways that he was mean to them. He's going to see himself probably as this perfectly calm person, except for these couple times, right, when he blew up for whatever reason.
I was a very non-aggressive kid. My older sister used to beat me up all the time. I have scars in my eyebrows and in my head from when she hit me with telephones and things like that. And my parents used to say, Paul, fight back. You're as big as she is now. But I wasn't a fighter. So what turned me for a long period of time into a fighter, into someone who struggled with anger management? I believe that it was the hatred that developed.
So yeah, again, this is the same clip as before, but just to kind of reiterate that it is very, very, very likely that the way he describes how his sister treated him is accurate. What very easily could be missing is his awareness of what he was doing to other people emotionally. So when you're dealing with someone who has a lot of cognitive blindness, they're not omitting that information on purpose. It's probably something that they're not aware of, and using this type of system may help point to areas where there's going to be a bias in the way that the person reconstructs their own narrative. And along those lines, part of Paul's narrative about himself is that he is a big introvert, right? This function, this little teeny tiny F identity, is what he sees, and he's aware of it. It obviously is a big force in his life to him, but it's not something that other people see, right? He sees the introvert on the inside. Everybody else sees the very blasty TESI who's just giving people a whole bunch of practical advice and telling him all about all of these physical experiences he's had. That's not what other people see.
You know, I don't think of you as being shy.
Well, that's because you only see the exterior. Inside is a very shy person.
Yeah.
So this is just a reminder that people see themselves very differently than the way that people on the outside see them. Okay, so cognitive blindness, we think that's what hard or easy for us should be hard or easy for others. This is a common mistake. Paul has hard time processing emotions, so he assumes that everybody else has a hard time processing emotions. We tend to see the external biggest functions, and that's not what other people see in themselves. Our demon functions can create mental blind spots that we don't notice. It may take a lifetime to fix, and it will take a lifetime to fix after you realize you need to, and most people don't realize that they need to. So something or some set of things happened to Paul at a very, very young age that caused him to feel like he needed to deal with his own anger, right? If someone had helped him with his emotional regulation, he would have probably never decided to go on this life journey. He actually had to recognize that this was a problem that he had in himself, and he decided to deal with it. He dedicated his life to understanding his emotions, understanding other people's emotions in very, very concrete terms, developed tools to communicate the components of emotional expression, make it easier to understand, and he worked on starting dialogue about higher level emotional processing with other people, kind of cooperating with others, that's hard for him. Cooperating on emotional stuff with people, that's really, really hard for Paul. And again, this picture of Paul listening to the Dalai Lama, just sitting there listening, not having a good time. And so I think this is one of the things that we really need to appreciate about other people, is that everyone is going on a life journey, and what is hard for them is different from what's hard for you. And when you understand their personality, you can recognize those big challenges. So when you see someone like Paul dedicating his life to better emotional understanding, it makes him a lot cooler, and it makes you respect his accomplishments all the more. So thanks, guys. Next time, we're going to be talking about Patrick Stewart. Good luck out there.